Oh, wow. Wasn't that great? Rocking in their school shoes, my girls from California. I love it. I love it. I love it. What a way to get started. Thank you, girls. Hey, girls and boys, what time is it? Right, it is story time. Fantastic. Welcome back. Aw, that was beautiful. Everybody's still out there rocking in their school shoes. Oh man, last time we had JJ singing for us. This time we had Ariel, Audrey, and Juliet singing. I bet you the others are out there singing too. You're probably just too shy to show it. Okay, anyway. Oh, before I get started, I just have to take a moment to express my sincere thanks to Anna for that lovely message that she sent me concerning one of our recent Storytime stories, the story about honey smoke. Yeah, she said that touched her as much as it touched me. I'm glad you love it, Anna. I loved it too. You know, let me tell you something. Anna, my daughter-in-law out there. You know, the sound daughter-in-law sounds so cold. I like to refer to her as my daughter-in-love, because it was love that brought her into our family. Thank you, Hannah. Hey, we got a very special Storytime edition for you today. It's going to be a two-parter, okay? First of all, we're going to have our regular Storytime reading. In fact, our book today is My Camel. My Camel Wants to Be a Unicorn. Sounds interesting. It's a book by Julia Incero and Tanya Varcelia. Okay, I hope I pronounced that right, in case you're looking for that in your local library. Anyway, we're going to get to that. And then after this, we're going to have a more serious discussion. As I told you a couple of episodes back, I wanted to have a discussion with you about my perception of racism, white supremacy, and all of those things that we're dealing with in today's world. So after we finish with the book, if any of you little kids aren't interested in that stuff, you don't have to hang around. I won't fault you. But some of you older kids, and especially you adults, I'd appreciate it if you hang around for this little discussion, okay? Anyway, let's get to My Camel Wants to Be a Unicorn. Here we have a little girl standing next to a camel. That's something you see every day. My camel wants to be a unicorn. I wonder what makes her think that. Take a look at the camel. My little sister had a birthday party. Look like they're on their way to the birthday party. It was unicorn themed, and my camel has not been right ever since. So she took her camel to a unicorn-themed birthday party, and something's been wrong with him ever since. Isn't that amazing? Of course, I wonder, where do little girls get camels from in the first place? But maybe that's another story. Was it because the unicorn gifts were so exciting? Is that possibly why it hasn't been right ever since? Because of the unicorn gifts? Was it the party hats everyone was wearing? See, she's wearing a little party hat. She's wondering if maybe that's what's causing her camel to act so strange. Maybe she ate too many unicorn cupcakes. Look at the camels over there. Her tongue is reaching in there, getting a little taste of unicorn cupcake there. Huh? All right. I'm not sure, but it's clear to me my camel wants to be a unicorn. See, she's made up her mind that that camel wants to be a unicorn. There could be no other answer except that camel wants to be a unicorn. I caught her trying to wear one of the party hats as a horn. It kept slipping down and covering her eyes. I love you the way you are, I told her. You're the best camel I have ever had. I kind of wonder how many camels she's had, but anyway, this is the best one. But my camel was distracted. Something is distracting the camel. I wonder what it could be. Okay. She tried making a horn out of a paper towel tube and a lot of tape. Look at that. She stuck a horn up there with some tape on her, so maybe she does want to be a unicorn. Why is she going through all of that? I tried to cheer her up. I took her on a roller coaster, and she barely offered a whee. Something is really distracting this camel and wanting to have a horn on her head. So I can understand why the little girl must think the camel wants to be a unicorn. Because not even the roller coaster excites her. I found her staring longingly into an ice cream shop, so I thought she wanted her favorite alfalfa cone. She ate the ice cream, but then stuck the cone on her head. Seemed like everything she gets, she sticks on her head so she looks like a unicorn. What's up with this camel? Wow. We went to the beach, but she didn't want to help me build a sandcastle. Things were getting serious. I needed my happy camel back. We visited the library, but she didn't even want to stay for story time. No, she didn't want to stay for story time? That's a disaster. Wow. We got out the paddling pool, but she wouldn't splash at all. Oh, I missed a page. Let me get this one here. We tried stargazing one night, but she couldn't stop wiggling. Okay. And then the paddling pool where she wouldn't splash? Okay. I was getting worried, so I took her to the doctor. Good thing she had a camel doctor close by. The doctor had her touch her toes, check her eyes, even had her stick out her tongue. Look at that, the tongue is all stuck out. You ever go to a doctor and they do that to you? I don't like it. Everything was normal, and yet I had one mopey camel. One day, we went for a walk in the woods. While walking, I asked, "Why do you want to be a unicorn?" Good question. Why do you want to be a unicorn? Camels have a big, furry hump. Unicorns only have a horn. But she didn't answer. I kept walking and then realized I was alone. Where was my camel? Well, the camel was gone. Ah, there you are, I said. Suddenly, I understood what she actually wanted, and I knew how I could help her. Ah, something became clear. As we raced home, I told her my idea, and she loved it. Okay, they're going to go home to try out this idea that's going to solve the problem. Let's see what it is. Look at that. She helped me dig through our garden tools to find my toy rake, and then through the ribbon bin, she chose the shiny purple. After a few adjustments, it was perfect. My camel is now the happiest camel on the block. She never wanted to be a unicorn. She just wanted a horn so that she could scratch her hump. She definitely is the best camel ever. Ah, that's sweet. Camel didn't want to be a unicorn after all. Just misunderstood. But then once we figured out what was wrong, we solved the problem. Wasn't that cute? My camel wants to be a unicorn. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Okay, anyway, let's get on that discussion that I was telling you about. The world is in a state in which I personally have never seen before. Is it bad? Is it good? I don't know. But I do think one thing. I think it's good that this discussion is now out in the open. It has festered along just too long. And the only way we're going to even come close to a solution is to bring it out in the open and discuss it. I want to discuss with you at least my perception of the subject of racism and white supremacy based on my studies and based on my personal experiences. And I want to share this with you, and hopefully some of it will be of value to you, because a lot of what I believe in and the way I live my life around this subject is based on biblical principles. And if I'm going to share this with you, I want to start out with just a short prayer with the Word of God, asking Him to lead me and to guide me as I share this with you, that hopefully it'll do you some good. So Father God, I ask you to just come among us right now and illuminate within me what your will is, that I may faithfully share it with my kids and my grandkids, my great-grandkids. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Let's start off with racism. What is racism? Well, let me tell you something. Racism, believe it or not, has not always existed. When you go back into ancient times, I mean ancient times, way, way, way back, men didn't divide themselves up by races. You had, men actually were divided up actually by languages rather than by race. If you look in Genesis 11, they talk about Nimrod, the Tower of Babel. Everybody spoke one language. It was when men divided up by languages was the first time in recorded history that we hear of this division among people. But you see, it's only natural human nature that when you have divisions among people, eventually you're going to have wars among those divisions. So I'm pretty certain that many of the first wars were between people that spoke one language to people that spoke different languages. And just as in any war, and because of the nature of man, you're going to have the victors and the vanquished. In other words, you're going to have the winners and the losers. And typically the losers become enslaved to the winners. Now, later in history, man put less emphasis on linguistic differences between themselves, and they began to divide themselves up mainly by nations. Different nations. I'm talking about ancient nations, not the nations we know today. The nations of ancient time, you wouldn't recognize it. The borders have changed over the millennia. So again, naturally, the natural instinct of man is to war with each other because of the evil in the world. So nation would rise up against nation, nation would war against nation. Because within a nation, you may have people that speak many different languages. It wasn't as easy to figure out, well, that guy speaks this language, so I'll just go over and fight with him and leave the rest of them alone. No, so nations were fighting rather than languages were fighting, okay? This happened, right all up through the Roman Empire. You know, the Empire of Rome fought against other nations. It wasn't a linguistic thing. But then there came a significant point in time, which is typically called the Age of Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment was the early 17th century. You know, that period between 1600 and 1700, where all of a sudden people stopped leaning on their faith in God and started leaning more towards their own understanding. You know, their science, their art, their literature. You ever see these old, ancient oil paintings of these guys in these big, white, curly, powdered wigs, and they're all dignified and everything? I mean, we're talking about back in the early 1600s. You see, I think at a time like that, the Age of Enlightenment, where all of a sudden man started feeling, hey, I know better. Kind of reminds me of that earlier time when God decided that, hey, I need to intervene and break these nations up, break these people up by language. Well, here we have nations fighting nations up until about the 17th century, and the time of enlightenment. The emphasis moved away from nations more towards physical differences between men. And I honestly believe that the beginning of this this age of enlightenment, this time when science and discovery was blooming, and at the same time the new world opened up. The colonies here in the new world were flourishing, and this emphasis on physical difference. Now we're warring against a person that looks one way against a person that looks another way. And because of the technology of one person over another, we now have races fighting races, and victors and vanquished. The vanquished becoming enslaved to the victor. And with the new world and the need for labor in the agricultural South, the slave trade then began, where these people that don't look like the other people could more easily be dehumanized. You see, the slave trade was already working here in the Americas back there in that age. In the 16th century, they were bringing slaves into the area where Columbus had come in the Caribbean to work in the sugarcane factories. Or the sugarcane fields, I should say, cutting cane, very labor intensive. And then a time came where the slave ship stopped off in the colonies. And because we are now in this new age of enlightenment, I honestly believe it opened a portal for a demon to enter the world. Think about that for a second. I want you to dwell on that moment, that I believe a demon entered the world at that point. So many things started happening that are hard to account for by any other way. Now we've got slavery in the United States, people being bought and sold that look different from the people that are doing the buying and selling. You understand? It was so easy to dehumanize them, to treat them like property, to treat them like livestock. There was an evil going on here that just suddenly manifested itself over that period of time. It started there. I believe it continued on. I believe it's here now, and I believe it will continue on, and I'll get to more of that in just a moment. Now, throughout the 17th century, say up into the 19th century, then this issue of having people treated like animals, the question came up. This may be the first time when the question came up about the value of black lives and whether or not they mattered. About 150, 160 years ago, which ultimately brought on the Civil War to answer that question. Now, it becomes evident to me that this battle of racism, this is where racism started, in my opinion, is in the 17th century, at this time of the Age of Enlightenment, okay? And I honestly believe it's demonic. I really do. I honestly do believe that it is demonic. It is spiritual warfare, and I believe it's playing out in a realm that is far beyond us. But we're living in it. We are being affected by it. You know, in the United States during the Civil War, I think even in the two battle hymns, there was something evident going on there. The evil of slavery, the pure horror of it in the South. But yet there was a spirit trying to defeat it. Listen, when you listen to the battle hymn of the Republic, when it talks about mine eyes have seen the coming, my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He's trampled down the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. What is the grapes of wrath? Can't be anything worse than slavery, huh? Yeah. Okay, but yet in the South, what do you got? Dixie? I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there, and I forgot. They wanted to keep this stuff up. Okay? There's a difference there. Just in the sound of the soundtrack of that time frame. Okay? So we've now talked about ancient history, we've talked about the 17th century, we've talked a little bit about the 19th century, which are the 1800s. After the Civil War, around 1865, between 1865 and I would say the 1960s, we had a period that was known as the Jim Crow era. Jim Crow era. That period of time was called Jim Crow. Why was it called Jim Crow? Well, Jim Crow, as I recall, was basically a cartoon character that white people used to draw as an insult to black people. This was some crow that always did stupid stuff or fell in a hole or whatever, and they could laugh about it and say, oh, that's black people. Okay, well, that was Jim Crow. So we call that era, from the end of the Civil War all the way up into the 1960s, the Jim Crow era. Well, what was happening in the Jim Crow era? Well, let me break it down into a couple of parts. The first part of it I call the Reign of Terror. Okay, right after the slaves, I'm not even going to call them slaves. I'm going to call them enslaved people, were freed. They lived through a reign of terror. I want to make a distinction between being a slave and being enslaved. You're only a slave if you're a slave in your mind. Yeah, you can be enslaved, but your mind don't have to be a slave. Keep that in mind, okay? All right, so this reign of terror, to give you an idea, right after the Civil War, there was a Reconstruction period where the South was being rebuilt because it was so heavily damaged. The infrastructure was blown up and everything. So it had to be rebuilt. The slaves were freed. They were given their freedom. They had the right to vote. They even had the right to run for offices. Some of the little towns that were primarily just all black people, they had black mayors and black judges and so forth. They had black representatives in the legislature and so forth. But that lasted only as long as the federal government kept federal troops down there to make certain things ran well. But unfortunately, the public didn't have an appetite for the cost of keeping federal troops down there in the South. So once the federal troops were drawn out of there, what happened? All those, well, I shouldn't say all, but many of those defeated white people started taking control again. There they formed different groups to start tearing down the structure that was put up during Reconstruction. One of the groups was called the Red Shirts. Now, the Red Shirts distinguished themselves by the fact that they wore red shirts whenever they wanted to be noticed. You know, they didn't hide their faces or anything, but they were the ones that were primarily in charge of dismantling Reconstruction. They were behind a lot of the assassination of black politicians, judges, and mayors, and so forth, and they rained terror all over the South after the North pulled out. Many people from the Red Shirts and other organizations eventually morphed into what became known as the Ku Klux Klan, okay, which really kind of continued on that what I call reign of terror. Only main difference between the Red Shirts and the Ku Klux Klan was the Ku Klux Klan tend to hide their identity, the hood and all that sort of stuff, you see. But what was happening was the black folks, even though they were relieved from slavery, they were constantly being harassed. They were constantly being murdered. They were constantly just life was horrible. Yeah, there were no services available to them. And of course, the laws were set up in such a way that there was just absolutely nothing that they could do, because no matter what you tried to do, you were wrong because you were black. Huh? Okay, let me give you one example of Jim Crow. There was a case where a black man was riding in a train in New Orleans, but he was in the wrong car. You see, the railroads were segregated. All the blacks had to sit together in a car in the back of the train, leaving all of the whites to have the rest of the train up there. Now, the railroads themselves, you can't blame them. They didn't like that idea because it caused them to have to put extra trains on the car. And sometimes there weren't a whole lot of white folks riding. There'd be a whole lot of empty seats, but yet the blacks weren't allowed to use them, and they'd be piled up into one old car, you know, like sardines in a can. Well, one day, one of the black guys, he couldn't take it, so he went up and sat in an empty seat in the train. He got arrested. He went to court. He had to fight this for years. He was convicted. I think he was fined something like, I don't know, $100, which was a whole lot of money back in those days. Okay. It got appealed and appealed and appealed, and it eventually reached the Supreme Court. And the case, when it reached the Supreme Court, was called Plessy versus Ferguson. And in the decision the Supreme Court made in Plessy versus Ferguson, it pretty much upheld segregation, that states could separate blacks from whites, according to Plessy versus Ferguson, as long as the accommodations were, how did they put it, equal? Okay. So, separate but equal. That's the term they use. As long as they can be separate, but they must be equal. That's the way the law was written. Well, how did that turn out? Have you ever seen pictures of the life down south under separate but equal? Just take a look at drinking fountains in bus stations. The white people, they have this nice little electric cooler, keeps the water nice and cool. You turn it on, it squirts up, and it sign over, white people only. Next to it, black people got this little porcelain sink. It's all cracked. When you turn the water, it barely gets past the faucet. You almost have to wrap your lips on the faucet to get some water out of it. Doesn't sound too equal to me. But that was the result of Plessy versus Ferguson, where they say, hey, as long as it's separate but equal, blacks and whites can stay apart. That's the same way with schools. Whites had nice schools with all the new books. Blacks had schools with hand-me-down books that were so tore up that the whites threw away. That's all the blacks had. But down south, they made it look like that was separate but equal. Okay? That's how we had to live under Jim Crow. Okay, that was just some of the things that we had to deal with under Jim Crow in the 19th century. But these problems go all the way into the 20th century because the black folks were still suffering from such actions from the white folks as burnings and beatings and lynchings. And it would be done with impunity. I mean, people could murder a person on a tree, and then crowds of them could gather around to have their picture taken. Women and children too in there, and be enjoying it like it was a picnic, while the bodies of somebody's son or somebody's father is hanging there. Okay? But that was the Jim Crow era, even in the 20th century. Okay? Let me give you another example. If you haven't heard about it already, look it up when you get a chance. You ever hear of Black Wall Street? Here's a good example. Many of the white people were always claiming, well, the blacks can't do anything for themselves, you know, and that we got to do it for them, and that was their biggest complaint. Well, that turned out to be a big lie, because in 1921, there was a thriving community just outside of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Actually, it was a suburb or a division of Tulsa, Oklahoma, I think it was called Greenburg or Greenville or something. Anyway, it had the nickname the Black Wall Street. This was a thriving black community. A thriving black community. It had its own schools. It had its shops. It had stores. It even had a performing arts theater. The people were doing well. It had its own bank. You know, it was a wonderfully thriving community. Until one day, the jealous white people from Tulsa came to town with a Gatling gun, and I'm told even an airplane, and bombed the city. They burned the building. They killed scores of people. They looted all the wealth out of the city. They injured hundreds of people. They took everything you may not have ever heard about it, because this is one of those events that gets buried in history. But it's an event you need to know about. This was an independent, self-sufficient society that the white folks couldn't stand to see succeed. Huh? That's racism. That's white supremacy. Okay. Let me tell you another story. You ever hear of Bloody Sunday? Bloody Sunday happened in a little town in Alabama called Selma. All the people in Selma wanted to do was vote. But they put so many obstacles in their way. You'd go into town to vote, and they'd make them answer all kind of stupid questions before they could vote. And if you got them wrong, you couldn't vote. Like, how many beans in the jelly beans in the jar? Huh? Stuff like that. You don't know. Or they'd give them some sort of weird test, literacy test that nobody could answer, Or even worse yet, they would have what was called a poll tax. They would make black folks pay to vote. Huh? Well, the day came that the black folks got fed up with this and said, look, we deserve the right to vote just like anybody. So all the black churches in Selma, and Selma's not a very big town, they got together and says, look, we're going to march into Selma right on up to that registrar's office and demand our rights to vote. Well, word got out that black people were coming now. Imagine Selma. Selma's a little town, and the only way you get into Selma from the black area is you got to come across the Alabama River to get into Selma. And the only way across the Alabama River is across a bridge called the Pettus Bridge. It's called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. You come across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and it brings you right into downtown Selma. Well, when the white folks found out that the black folks were marching into Selma to demand their right to vote, Well, the sheriff was waiting for them at the foot of that bridge. The sheriff by the name of Bull Connors. Bull Connors. The name itself is pretty intimidating. Bull. You got to watch out when Bull comes after you. Well, Bull had his men sitting there waiting at the bottom of the bridge. And he had a whole bunch of deputized civilians, which were nothing but Ku Klux Klansmen, standing there with long axe handles and clubs and pipes, and so waiting for these peaceful black people that just wanted to vote. As these people came across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bull Connors unleashed his forces on them. With police dogs, with clubs, he was beating the people, the women, the kids. Selma called in their fire department with their high pressure hoses. They were squirting them down with these high pressure hoses, knocking them down against the walls and everything, just because they wanted to vote. I mean, people were getting bones broken. They got their heads smashed, and they all ran back across the bridge back to their homes, bloodied and beaten and everything, just because they wanted to vote. Well, that caught the attention of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King came down to Selma, and he saw what had happened. These folks tried to go across that bridge to vote, and they got beat back. So Dr. King put out a call across the entire country. He said, if you believe in freedom, come to Selma. If you believe in fairness, come to Selma. If you believe in justice, come to Selma. And they came. And they came. Look at this. And they came. Thousands of them. Thousands of them. Thousands of them. And they marched across that bridge. And they marched into Selma. And they marched right through Selma, all the way to Montgomery, the capital, and demanded their right to vote. Let me tell you something. You see those people coming across the Edmund Pettus Bridge? That affected me so much. I took the time. Here's Grandpa standing there at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I had to be there. I had to go. Of course, this was about 50 years later, but I was there in spirit. Okay, they marched across that Edmund Pettus Bridge all the way to Montgomery in I believe it was 1963. By 1960, let me get this right. Bloody Sunday was in 1965, yeah. Okay, that's when the Voting Rights Act was passed, okay. That's when President Lyndon Johnson finally gave black people the right to vote. But before then, we had a march on Washington. Dr. Martin Luther King had called nearly 500,000 people to march on Washington demanding their civil rights. And that's what resulted in the Civil Rights Act, okay? Yeah, the March on Washington was in 1963, and the Civil Rights Act was in 1964. Okay, now moving right along. There is a racist, white supremacist system that permeates every activity that human beings engage in. Every activity that you could possibly think of. The racist white supremacist has already set up a system to make you fail if you're a person of color. Now, there is a person by the name of Dr. Frances Cress Welsing who wrote a book called The ISIS Papers, Key to the Colors. And in her book, she breaks down human activities into 10 categories. Anything you possibly can do falls into one of these 10 categories. And they are law, war, education, economics, religion, entertainment, politics, labor, sex, and literature. Okay? Think about that for a second. No matter what you do, you're going through one of those categories. And the racist white supremacist has already set up their system in all of their categories. So, as a person of color, I'm telling you, it's an unfair and unlevel playing field, okay? Just keep that in mind. Well, you might ask, well, how is racism manifested, white supremacy manifested? Well, it's in their perception, it's in their logic, it's in their thought, it's even in their speech, it's in their emotional responses to things. It's in the symbolic foundations, some of the ways they lay things out, and of course it's in their actions. Okay. And they've used all of these in those different areas to set up a system that provides a benefit that all white people have, and it's called white privilege, whether they know it or not. So knowingly or unknowingly, all white people have white privilege because of a system that was set up by the racist white supremacists. I am not saying all white people are racist and white supremacists, but I'm saying they all benefit from that system. That's all I'm saying, okay? But white supremacists promotes an evil, unclean spirit that delights in hatred, conflict, and violence. Now, these aren't my words. These are the words of Dr. Let's see, what was her name? I think it was called Susan Thistlethwaite, and she is Professor Emeritus of the Chicago Theological Seminary. Okay? But keep that in mind, that it promotes an unclean spirit that delights in hatred, conflict, and violence. And she says it's profoundly wicked. Now listen to that for a second. An unclean spirit. I said before that I think it's demonic. She seems to agree with me, okay? I honestly believe that white supremacists are at best demonically influenced and at worst demonically possessed. Yeah. You see, there is an unclean spirit that they believe. Read 1 John 4:1. Talks about the unclean spirit. Think about Nazis for a second. Now, Nazis were the quintessential white supremacist racists, right? Well, it's a fact that they dabbled in the occult. You know that movie Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark? That wasn't far from true. I do believe they were looking for the Ark of the Covenant. There's also a device called the Lance of Destiny, which it is believed that Hitler either had or was seeking. What is the Lance of Destiny? That's the spear that was used to pierce Christ's side while he was on the cross. It said the person that wields that spear can never be defeated in battle. And Hitler was looking for it. Okay. So what's my conclusion? Racism, white supremacy is demonic. See, nothing else could explain the depravity of slavery, the inhumanity that one man put on another man. Nothing but a demon could explain that level of evil, okay? And I believe that this evil this demon entered the world during the Age of Enlightenment. He came back. He was always alive. He had been thrown out at one time, but he came back again. That's my belief. Yeah. Any military general would tell you that that in order to defeat an enemy, you have to know who that enemy is. And I believe I know who that enemy is. Yeah. I'll tell you in just a second. Yeah, I do believe that it started at the Age of Enlightenment, and I believe it's going to be with us until that demon is thrown into the pit of hell with Satan and the other demons. And who do I believe that demon is? I believe that demon is Legion. Mark 5:8. You ever read that story? Let me tell you about Legion. There was a man that was possessed by a legion. He was so possessed that he had powers that was unimaginable. People were not even able to hold him down. This guy had powers. He could break out of anything. If you chained him up, he could break those chains like King Kong on Broadway. Because Legion was in him, possessed him. It caused him to just throw himself around and cut himself up. But one day, when Christ approached that man, Legion immediately recognized Christ and actually worshiped him and said, "What have I to do with you? You just..." And Christ's first question is, "What is your name?" And Legion says, "I am Legion because I am many." See, in the military, a legion is at least 5,000 soldiers. So there may have been 5,000 or even more demons in this one man. They were so powerful, so strong, that when Christ called them out of him and cast them into a herd of about 2,000 pigs, all of those pigs became possessed and threw themselves over and drowned themselves in the ocean. But Legion didn't die. You see, a soul can die, Ezekiel 18:20, but Legion didn't die. Spirits are eternal, you know? Legion's going to spend eternity in that fiery pit. But right now, he's loose in the world. And I do believe that that is the unclean spirit inside the racist white supremacists. The racist white supremacists created and they maintain a system that all white people, either knowingly or unknowingly, are benefiting from to the detriment of people of color. There is institutional racism in both the private sector and the public sector, both government and in private companies. It exists, okay? Basically what I'm saying is there's an uneven playing field out there, and it's necessary that you know that. But how do you live with it? Number one, you pray. You pray, you pray, you pray. And you don't make yourself a victim. You make yourself a conqueror. Okay? Because God is on your side. Romans 8:31 through 39 tells us that we're conquerors. So we pray. Okay? That's one thing that we do. And you've got to remember that this is a spiritual battle. This is going on at a spiritual level. When you meet one of these racist, white supremacist guys, tobacco chewing, redneck type guy, just remember, there's an unclean spirit in him. And he's just a stooge of that spirit, you know? Don't blame him. Pray for him. Pray that God will soften his heart, illuminate his mind, you know? You see, God has already disarmed the demons. Yeah, he did. According to Colossians 2:15. So we're already winners. So let's live like winners. Carry yourself with dignity. You will command respect, no matter what. I want you to be aware of the existence of racism. It's pervasive. It's all around us. But don't use it as an excuse if you're not doing your part. Because if you do, then you're really hurting the cause of racial justice. You know, people that are always pulling the race card. Well, you don't like me because I'm black and all that sort of stuff. That's a bunch of bunk. No. You have to truly be living up to a standard, you know? And as much as possible, try to get along with all people as much as possible. You know, show kindness and respect. Because if you do, then you will command respect. That's what I try to do. I treat people the way they treat me. And if I ever find myself around someone that I just cannot deal with, I just separate myself from them. I don't argue. You know, I don't drag myself down that hole. I don't need to be around them. If they're that incorrigible, I move on. I don't need them. Think about that, okay? Don't immerse yourself in useless racial arguments with people. It serves no purpose. Yeah. And just finally remember that you're a child of God. Okay, remember that. The racist white supremacists, as I said before, they're a stooge of demons. So which team would you rather be on? So keep that in mind. That's the way I look at it, and that's the way I see it. Father God, I ask that you bless this time that we had together. I ask that the things that I share be in accord with your will. And I ask that you just give my kids the strength, the wisdom, and the love that they need to make it through this world. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.